Switch the presentation. So we're going to invite Chris, where's Chris? Chris Zabek from the Ministry of Agriculture to give us a snapshot of wildfires and livestock. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Erin. If you look back far enough in time, I'm a plant guy, so I find it somewhat surreal to be addressing an audience of this nature. My knowledge of what you folks do on a day-to-day basis and the technical nuts and bolts of that is less than pathetic, and if you doubt that, I notice I have a number of colleagues from the Animal Health Center here, and they would probably be more than happy to verify my relative uselessness. But one of the things that useless people like myself do is get called in on various emergency response things in which the province has a role to play. And one of those, certainly that has been gaining in stature, has been wildfire response. So in 2017, beginning of July, there was a system that moved through a large swath of the southern, central, and interior part of the province, a lot of dry lightning strikes, and the term that was used by fire professionals was that it basically blew up with the number of strikes. 2017 was the worst year on history until 2018 as far as hectares burned. But when you look at the actual impact on humans, on businesses, on the sorts of things that that we were responding to, 2017 was still by far the worst impact. And it occurred in a large swath of the province, but the main fire areas were in the Caribou Regional District and the Thompson-Nicola Regional District. And one of the things which tends to get ignored a bit in the nightly roll-up on news is that through a large portion of BC, extensive livestock grazing goes on in all sorts of regional biomes. In 2017, estimated numbers were over 30,000 livestock were in the fire-impacted areas. The vast majority would have been cattle, but that did take into account other types as well. So emergency response is actually something that is legislated in the province. Under that legislation, the first line of defense and responsibility is the individual, which does make a lot of sense. But when you've got a situation that is beyond the ability of an individual to cope with, then the local government authority is the next line of responsibility, and they provide assistance and coordination. When it's beyond the ability of the local government to deal with, then the province provides support down to the local government and thus to the individuals as well. And take that one step further, the feds also support the province as needed. So I just saw it with a very one-dimensional view of the world. We were called in by Emergency Management BC to help with livestock issues, and I chose to focus just on a couple of program areas that we looked at, a couple of needs that, this is very non-technical, but may stimulate some discussions, certainly with the climate change overarching theme that we're looking at. So us being very simple creatures, when we think about, my gosh, there's X number of cattle in an area where there's X number of fires, what do we do? How do we prevent them from dying? Our first response is, well, let's remove them from the threat. Seems logical, not always possible, but we'll touch on that a little bit later on as well. Where it's not possible to remove those livestock, what are they doing for care? What are they eating? And it seems logical as well that if a fire goes through and removes the forage base, those livestock that are left in the area may not be physically harmed, but they're going to get hungry pretty quickly. And it's also worth noting, that our efforts are aimed at livestock that are part of a farm business. This sort of support doesn't apply to companion animals or hobby animals or those types of critters. So under relocation, looking at that first prong that I mentioned, we were able some years ago to work with Emergency Management BC to create the very creatively named provincial support for livestock relocation during an emergency. But it was descriptive. And basically what that does is it enables livestock reimbursements when they're relocated out of an area that's been declared under evacuation alert or evacuation order by the local authority. So your trucking costs, your feeding, your care costs, those are things which the local government can then pay for directly on behalf of the ranchers who are impacted, and the province then reimburses the local government. So it requires all three of those levels, the individual, the local authority, and the province to implement that. 2017 was a new beast for us just based on the size of the fire areas and how dynamic and rapidly moving those fires were. And I mentioned before that relocation is not always an option. Well, 2017 pointed that out in spades, which kind of makes sense. If you've got thousands of animals spread out over hundreds of thousands of hectares, how realistic is it that you're going to be able to get those animals rounded up when they're scattered across the range 10 years? Where are you going to get trucks to take thousands of animals to on short notice, and where are you going to take them to? So a lot of times it was just a case of the animals moving around ahead of, in amongst the fires. Perhaps ranchers were able to gather them down at the home place and put them on irrigated fields where the fire risk was a lot less. Much better than having the animals die out on the range, but then you've got animals that are pounding those hay fields perhaps that the rancher was going to rely on to put up his winter feed source. So now we had a scenario where there's thousands and thousands of animals out there, and they may not have a lot to eat right now, or they definitely won't have something to eat come fall when they should have been going up onto hay that should have been put up but couldn't be because of the fires. So this program was basically sketched out and approved by EMBC to try and bring in hay for those animals that had sheltered in place for the immediate need. And this one took, because it was brand new, it took a bit of adapting on the fly. But again, it was something that local governments were the lead on, but there was a lot more support required from the province to actually enable this, from the logistical nuts and bolts of finding this hay, getting it there, putting the program together, all those sorts of things. So what actually happened? Well, under the relocation piece, of those 30,000 plus animals that were estimated to be in the affected areas, something over 1,400 were actually relocated from the high-risk region to a lower-risk region. Some of them had to be evacuated more than once as fires flared up and moved around. The reimbursement piece went fairly well by local government to the service providers and then the province to local government. But I think it's fair to say that it probably went better towards the end of the wildfire season than it did at the start. And a lot of that was just due to communication and familiarity, and it pointed out to us that that's something you need to be on top of all the time, especially as key people rotate in and out of a response. Another lesson that I think we learned was that not just the nature of the emergency, so how fast the fire is moving and how many fires there are, but the nature of the farm business dictates whether relocation is even feasible. And if I've got 1,000 cow-calf pairs out there, I can't move them anywhere. So that's where the outcomes of the emergency hay program that started in 2017, that was accessed by 76 ranches throughout the Caribou and the Thompson-Nicola, provided over 7,600 tons of hay to over 17,000 assorted livestock. Again, the majority would have been cattle, but there were sheep and working horses and I believe some goats in there as well. And what did we learn there? Again, the nature of the emergency. We may know that there's cattle sheltered in place in a certain area, but until the threat level is down to the point that the incident commander will deem it responsible to send trucks in, you may have to be able to think a bit creatively and have things staged and ready to go, but you can't get a truck in there until the flames are down. Trying to find that much hay is an interesting challenge, especially when there's large areas under drought conditions and hay production was poor to start with. And the size of the farm or ranch is varies a lot as well, and interestingly, the logistics of getting hay to a large ranch were a lot easier than getting it to one that had very few animals at times. Just a couple of other factors that we ran into. There were several hundred kilometers of fencing that were destroyed in the fire. A lot of that was along highways, so safety aspect for the animals that are out on range as well as the motorists. The range branch in Flynn Road did a fantastic job of trying to get that priorized and replaced as soon as possible, but it's something that takes time. Injuries and mortalities. It's a challenging one to come up with reliable numbers. Best estimates we got from anecdotal information in 2017 was 40 to 50 animals either perished in the fire or had injuries severe enough that they had to be put down. But I'd fully acknowledge that that's a pretty loose sort of estimate, because there's no protocol in place for accurate reporting, and sometimes ranchers are self-reliant folks. If they lose a few animals on the range, they're just going to take care of it themselves and move on with life. So just as a wrap up, I think what came out of this for me anyway was that we were doing things to address the immediate need, trying to get feed, care, and transportation in there. There is some support for longer-term pieces, infrastructure that ranchers need to get back into business, how to get that forage base established again so that there would be support for the livestock themselves, business planning needs. But it's always easier to do things. There's always more energy available to put into an immediate response, and I do think we need to continue to focus on longer-term needs to help ranchers adapt to the situation as well. I couldn't resist saying the emotional toll that some of these people experienced for months and months and months was significant. And they're thinking as well, like this was 2017, and then for some of them this was 2018. When you look at the amount of fuel that's out there through pine beetle kill, you look at the changing fire season. It used to be 6 to 8 weeks long. Now it runs from May through September. So with climate change, is this the new normal? And if so, where do we go from here and how do we improve it? Thank you.